One of my favorite things about sampling, and especially sample chopping, is the unpredictability of it, the increased likeliness of happy accidents. You never really know what you're going to get until you start chopping and messing around with things, and there's a beauty in that. What's also cool about this is that you can either increase or reel in the experimental nature of this technique, almost like a sliding scale to fit your genre or goals. You can come up with interesting samples or loops to ride around, or you can focus on specific instruments or frequencies. Here are some examples. This is also inadvertently a wonderful way to make samples your own. The way they're going to be tuned and processed, or the other sounds they're going to be mixed with to create a new whole, will most probably be different from how they would have ended up sounding if you approached them more conventionally. Finally, it's also a great way to beat writer's block. Don't know what to write? Just depend on this technique's randomness to make something unpredictable or break your beat block by getting inspired through experimentation. It's important to have patience, as this technique is quite literally experimental and it might not work perfectly right off the bat. Saying that, it could also work surprisingly quick, but you never know. Embrace the nature of this exercise and enjoy the process. It's all about trial and error and having fun with random melodic samples, opposed to just getting a beat done as soon as possible. With that said, here's what you're going to need to get going. I'll be using my MPC One, and although this is not an MPC specific exercise, you can use whatever hardware or software sampler you want. The MPC does have an advantage though, its auto key detection functionality, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. Are we trying to make an interesting bass line? Are we writing a lead? Are we creating a main sampled loop? Also, what is the tone or feeling we're aiming for? Are we making something laid back, aggressive, or energetic? These are important things to consider before we start, so that we can minimize frustration and maximize fun. This will act as our foundation and would have been informed by our previous step. Find a chord progression that captures the tone and feel you want for your track, and make sure you know what key you're in. This doesn't have to be set in stone, you can change the chords later, but I highly recommend you stay within the same key because that's what everything else will be based on. This is optional, but I find it helpful to chop melodic samples when I have a rhythm or beat to use as a reference. So again, even if you plan on changing the beat or the sound a bit later, it's good to just have a rough drum idea to use as a rhythmic guide. This will also dictate your tempo. You can obviously just use a metronome here, but I prefer an actual drum beat. Finally, and most importantly, although mostly anything goes here, I recommend you gather at least 16 one-shot or short loops of melodic samples, as they will work best. We want enough samples to fill one bank on most samplers basically. That's usually more than enough. This can be sample pack stuff or sampled commercial music. If you use the latter, I'd recommend that you chop these longer samples into smaller usable one-shots or loops. Again, what you collect here would have been informed by your musical goal or idea in the second point. I will point out that you will get the best results with melodic samples that aren't too busy. The more isolated the sound, the better. Also, be mindful of the frequencies you need. It doesn't make sense to throw in bass samples if you're trying to create a lead line and vice versa. So we have our ingredients, now let's start cooking. I chopped up this drum break, which I'll use as my rhythmic loop. It's 82 BPM and I like the pacing. Now I can either write some chords or I can make some using one-shots or other samples. I settled on chopping this Rhodes chord progression, which after tuning ended up being in D major. I'm aiming to just make a chill beat here, something laid back but kind of quirky and uplifting. So that's my goal. So we have our drum beat and a chord progression that are playing nice together. Foundationally, I have two elements that both lean towards the feeling I'm going for, and they're also working in terms of tempo and rhythm. We'll be using this technique to come up with our main sampled loop as well as a bass line. If you're finding this video helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you could like this video and subscribe, as I'm trying to build the channel into something more significant. I have a whole bunch of other MPC and sampler videos in the works, so I hope to see you around. Because I want to illustrate how you can accentuate the unpredictability of your beat or song with this technique, we're going to be combining a variety of elements to create our main melodic sample loop. I've gathered 16 different sounds to chop, You can blindly throw 16 completely random samples in here too, but again, to maximize the amount of useful stuff, make sure that these are playing some kind of melody or even lead line. Very important, it doesn't matter what tempo or keys these samples are in. Do make sure that these are all either in the same mute group or on the MPC. Make sure you set your program to mono so that all 16 pads can cut each other off. We do not want polyphony here. We do this under our program's program edit menu in the global tab. Another good thing to do would be to add a high pass filter on our program or overall sampler instrument so that we can filter out the low frequencies as we're looking to make a melody, which will occupy our mid and high frequencies. We don't want to muddy up our lows as that's for our kick and future bass line. So now I have a bank of 16 samples loaded into my MPC. As mentioned previously, the MPC has auto sample key detection, which is a big deal for this technique. As we individually go through each sample, you can see in the program edit mode under samples what the different keys of my one-shots or loops are. The most obvious workaround for this if you do not have an MPC is to just make sure that all your random samples are in the same key. Most sample packs nowadays are well labeled, so it shouldn't be too much of a pain, but it does kill some of the fun as I prefer to just throw in literally anything that sounds interesting to me, regardless of the key, but I digress. The next thing we do is to tune these samples to fit with our already established chord progression. I know my progression is in D major, so I'm going to go through each of these 16 pads and tune them to D major. This is where the trial and error becomes apparent. Some samples will be tuned up and down rather drastically, some of them beyond the point of apparent use, but that's okay, it's only our first run at this. A quick tip regarding tuning in the MPC, my chord progressions is in D major, but some of the samples I dropped in are in a minor key, and you might get confused about how to get these minor samples into our major key. If you're not familiar with it already, we'll be using the circle of fifths or the Camelot wheel. Without going into too much depth, this is a wheel chart used for harmonic mixing by DJs or even by classically trained musicians, and part of its purpose is to basically show which musical keys play nice together. I might do a video on this in the future, but for this tutorial we're just going to use the wheel to see which minor key will work harmonically with our D major key. You can just reference an online image of the circle of fifths or find a free app for your phone. I'll leave some links in the description. I have some samples that are in minor keys. If I change their tuning on the MPC, it's going to stick to minor keys, but we need it to work in D major. So we go to the circle of fifths and look for the D major key. We can see that D's major relative minor key is B minor. So we go back to the MPC and we tune all the minor pads to B minor and obviously all the majors to D. This should make all your samples play nice regardless if they're in a minor or a major. A workaround to this again is to just either work in minors or majors and to not mix them. That way you can just tune them with the MPC and not worry about relative keys. But again, there's something to be said about mixing anything regardless of key or tempo. I think it's also important to mention that the MPC's auto key detection isn't perfect. Because we're throwing a lot of different sounds at it, some more harmonically rich or busy than others, it might not always get it right, but that's okay and we're not going to get precious about the samples we use. So now we're at a point where all 16 of our sounds are tuned to at least more or less work in the key of D major. Now, if we hit play on our chord progression and beat and play our one-shot samples, they all should sound in tune. Don't worry about the samples' individual tempos at this point. If they sound obviously too fast or too slow compared to our project tempo of 82 BPM, that's okay, we'll still get to this. The final bit of prep we'll be doing is to set some rough volume levels for our samples. Because of the possibly drastic tuning and different sources, some pads might sound a lot louder or softer than others. We want them to be roughly equally loud so that we can properly hear what we're doing. On the MPC, I'll hit play to loop my chords and beat, and then I'll go to the pad mixer and I'll individually adjust each pad's volume to achieve this. Finally, the really fun part starts. Our samples are all in tune and appropriately leveled, so I'm just going to loop my chords and beat and experiment by playing my sample chops over it, to see if I can come up with an interesting melody as my main sample loop. Here you'll quickly notice what works and what doesn't. Some pads might end up being pitched too high or too low to cut through the mix, some tempos might be way out of whack, some samples might still sound out of tune, etc. You might be able to find something workable really quickly, or you might have to tweak the bank a bit. Make sure you try different chopping rhythms and really push what you have to get the best results. Don't give up or move on too quickly. In the likely case that a bunch of samples clearly don't work, simply delete those pads and replace them with additional samples. If you do end up replacing samples, make sure they are tuned and leveled like the samples in the initial round, and then repeat until you're happy with what you're getting out of the bank. If you don't delete samples, you can just use sound design and obviously just tweak them via tuning, effects, or envelopes to get what you need out of them. You simply won't know what is needed until you start experimenting. One thing will lead to another. Regarding tempo, because some samples would have been tuned up or down quite heavily, some samples might unexpectedly work like that, and others won't. If the sample sounds cool in your pattern but the tempo is clashing too much, consider time stretching it if it's not too much of a jump in terms of unpleasantly degrading the sample. If after tweaking the tempo or time stretching the sample still doesn't work, don't be precious about it, just delete it and find another chop to replace it with. You obviously might not end up using all 16 slices for your melody, but you should end up with some exciting results at the very least. Some interesting stuff you most probably wouldn't have come up with otherwise. So after a bit of tweaking and replacing, this is the main sample melody loop I came up with. It's usually good to process these chops as a group with EQ and a compression, some saturation effects, or even a bit of reverb to glue them together as a unit more. Although I've made this video using a 4-bar loop, I'd actually recommend an 8-bar loop as it'll give you more room for variation and it could make your loop sound less repetitive. Depending on what you set out to do or what you ended up with, there are many ways forward from here, but at the very least you'll have a great groundwork to work from. Let's pursue a less experimental version of the same technique. If you're more of a genre purist, a lot of these previous results might end up sounding a bit too messy to you, but like I mentioned before, you can reel the technique in by focusing on just one instrument or frequency area. Let's make a bass line using the same method. So instead of just grabbing random samples of random sounds and instruments, we can make things a bit less experimental by honing in on just bass samples. I can add a bunch of random bass samples from guitars to synths to orchestral sounds, but we want things a bit more cohesive this time around. So we're gonna go for just an electric bass guitar. With that in mind, I collected 16 bass guitar samples. I tuned them to work with my chord's key of D major and I adjusted their levels. Like previously, we played our main loop, including or excluding the sample loop we created earlier, and just messed around with our different bass chops to come up with a bass line that we like. It sounds like this. As much as this technique is based around randomness and happy accidents, hopefully you'll see that with a bit of imagination and planning, you can use it to various degrees to create whatever you want. It's an exciting, versatile sample workflow as it can be experimental and crazy or more focused depending on how you go about it. If you end up trying this technique, please drop some links in the comments. I'd love to hear what you came up with. Also, don't hesitate to ask questions. I'm always reading the comments. And have fun. Until next time, tot ziens.